Support for this program is provided by
Hey everyone, thanks you for joining us. My name is Will Glover, and this is the Future of Work Town Hall. K-12 education in the United States is suffering, and in some Michigan schools and districts, they're facing teacher shortages. Some struggle with being properly funded. Politics and the fear of another instance of gun violence can tinge conversations we have around teaching young Michiganders with an inescapable feeling of unease. Education is a precursor to success and is paramount to Michigan's future. If we don't get this right, then we may be saying no to innovation, no to job creation, and no to a brighter future for Detroit and Southeast Michigan. So to help us see where we are, what we need to do, and who's doing it, we have some wonderful panelists here today. So let's start with the State Education Policy Reporter for Chalkbeat Detroit and Bridge, Michigan, Tracy Morello. Tracy, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Hi, Will. Thanks for having me on here. I'm really excited to be on here with the other panelists who are true experts, one in how schools are funded. Craig Thiel is somebody that I really depend on a lot to explain the complexities of education funding. And Dr. Zachary Ross, the superintendent in Ypsilanti. I visited her schools and her teachers are amazing. They're just truly skilled in classroom management and a lot of other things. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from both of them.
Yeah, we have definitely a good group here today. So I want to start with you because you do a lot of coverage overall when it comes to just education in general. Can you give us kind of an overview of some of the bigger issues that you're seeing, schools, districts, and trying to get teachers and things like that? What are some of the bigger issues that we're facing today?
Sure. Right now, Michigan has been struggling for a long time. It's been in the bottom half of states as far as performance of schools. And Michigan students were really starting to gain some ground before the pandemic. They were catching up to other states. And then the pandemic just blew everything out of the water for everyone. So one of the biggest issues that we have in Michigan and elsewhere around the country is to help these kids catch up. They had 2 years of disjointed learning. Some kids were bounced back and forth between virtual and in-person learning a number of times. At the same time, we have districts are having a very hard time finding teachers. Now, whether we call that a teacher shortage or not is kind of nuanced. And I think when we hear from Craig a little bit later, I hope that he'll delve into that a little bit more about some of the reasons for that and whether it actually is a shortage or something else going on.
Right. And so because we're kind of going to be focusing on teachers today, if there is an actual shortage, what are some of the ripple effects we might see downstream when it comes to what might be a dwindling teaching corps?
So a number of things are happening because there aren't enough teachers in some areas. The understaffing, it has been a real problem. It's resulted in less qualified teachers. At the same time, it's really motivated teacher prep programs to get on the ball and really try to attract candidates from different segments. A lot of second career teachers are coming into teacher prep programs now. School districts are making efforts they're calling it grow your own. They're trying to get their paraprofessionals, bus drivers, any kind of support staff that's already in the schools. They're finding ways to help train them to become certified teachers. But if this doesn't get done, we're really facing some trouble down the road. We're going to have an underprepared workforce. So this is really something crucial. It's urgent. It's an urgent problem.
Right. And so whether or not you want to call it a teacher shortage or something else, there are issues there when it comes to actually having physical people in the classrooms who are qualified to teach. And obviously there are going to be ripple effects as we go into the future if we don't address these things. So that said, I'd like to bring in the research director for the Citizens Research Council of Michigan, Craig Thiel, and Ypsilanti School Superintendent, Dr. Elena Zachary Ross. Thank you both for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you for having us, Will. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. So, Craig, let's start with you, with exactly what we're talking about. Is it a shortage or not? Because some of the work that you guys have done indicate that it's not as clear cut as simply being a shortage of teachers. So could you just explain that a little bit for us?
Yes, certainly. And just to emphasize, I come at this from a research perspective. I don't have the lived experience that Dr. Ross has in running a school district and actually having the challenges of staffing those classrooms to make sure our young learners are as best prepared as they can be when they leave her schools. But from the research perspective, and this is not just me, this is generally across the country, claims of a general teacher shortage are somewhat overblown. It's a much more nuanced problem. And so the language that I tend to use and researchers tend to use are, staffing challenges or staffing problems within our public schools. And those are real. Those are real. And as alluded to by Tracy, they have kind of a brighter light shined on them as a result of the pandemic. But many of the challenges that face our public schools in Michigan and across the country predate this pandemic. And just in summary, what we know is that certain schools in certain locations and certain classrooms are much more harder to fill with a qualified full-time instructor than other classrooms and districts and schools. We can talk about the details of that, but I think that's an important nuance to understand. And just, if it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyways, the research literature, again, suggests that the number one input into the performance of our K-12 students throughout their careers is having a highly qualified teacher in front of them, leading instruction, developing curriculum, leading instruction, helping students that may not be on the path to success and intervening when that's necessary. So the teacher is the most important component in our whole K through 12 education system.
Right. And so if we're not getting the teacher aspect right, then I'm sure it makes everything else that comes after that much more difficult. But you mentioned a little bit of something about being more specific about why we're having issues in specific areas when it comes to getting teachers in the classrooms. Can you just explain a little bit about what some of those details are?
Right. So generally what we've seen is that certain schools throughout the state have had a challenge staffing classrooms. Those tend to be in communities of low income, higher poverty, and it's because the challenges outside of the classroom come into the classroom, and teachers are expected to meet those challenges. And quite honestly, a number of our teachers just don't have the training in that. So that is a challenge. What we see in those classrooms is that there's a higher rate of mobility. So teachers might be placed in those classrooms for year one, and then the next year they move. They might move out of that school. They might move within the district. But what we do see is they move outside of the district. So there's a churn there. Another component of the research suggests that continuity of instruction and of teachers really adds to a student's success rate. So with that constant churn in schools, and I can only imagine the challenges of a superintendent, being a full-time human resource manager in one of those schools. So those higher poverty, low income schools are more difficult to staff. And that's where we see the greatest number of vacancies. And then we can drill down into the type of classrooms. And this has been fairly consistent over years, again, with the pandemic shining a light on certain classrooms, but special education classrooms, teachers who are trained to deal with students who come to school with physical, emotional, cognitive challenges. those teachers have a additional training and certificates to meet the needs of those children. And what we find is those classrooms are more difficult to staff. And with the pandemic, we've seen other classrooms added to that mix, but special ed, math and science teachers in the high school grades are classes that are more difficult to staff. And then career technical education classrooms are more difficult to staff. So as students take part in learning in those classrooms, they have a higher chance, quite honestly, of not having a fully credentialed teacher to meet their needs.
Right. So, Dr. Ross, we've alluded to it a couple times already. You have real world experience with dealing with this stuff. Are Ypsilanti schools feeling a shortage of teachers, and how are you navigating that? What are you seeing? What do you encounter?
Definitely, we see shortages in all staff. Is not just the teacher shortage, but that's the one that's the most impactful in our classrooms. And I definitely agree. They're in specialty areas, especially in special education, our English language learner classes, as well as our CTE programs. And then just the highly qualified status needed for our secondary schools. Those are the positions that we're seeing needs in. We know that in the hunch, again, the rationale of why, number one, we've gone into smaller class sizes. So we actually do need more teachers than probably when the research talked about it, because we haven't gone into the larger class sizes anymore. Secondly, teachers used to come in. I mean, they are dedicated. They come in, when they were sick, they come in when they were stressed. And now teachers have learned during the pandemic, I have to first take care of myself. Their family situations might have changed. So although we have teachers who hold certificates in Michigan, we find that there are earlier retirements. There are people that are taking leaves. And so that has required us to need more staff in our buildings.
Right. So one of the things I wanted to also ask is, are you coming up against things like teachers requiring higher salaries, better benefits packages, or is it the lack of people to even try to court with higher salaries and better benefits package? Is it what schools are able to give, or is it the fact that there just aren't enough people for schools to get through the door and into the classroom?
Well, school finance is always a huge issue. I will not argue with anyone. We need to pay our teachers more. They are required to do more. They're required to keep their certifications up. If a person with that same level of education was in another field, they'd be paid much higher. So yes, we need to pay teachers more, and it goes with the structure. We know that the School Finance Research Collaborative in 2018 came up with what we need to be paying, what we need to actually truly fund education. And that was a huge shortfall. And we understand that, yes, other school districts can pay more in districts that have, taxable house values that are higher. And so that then brings the competition, and teachers being recruited with the shortage, teachers being recruited to other districts, teachers going to other districts due to that. And so we really match the funding formula for schools with higher poverty with EL students and with the CTE needs. With that new study from 2021, we can certainly meet that financial obligation.
Can I piggyback off something that Dr. Zachary Ross said? You were talking about competition, and that's very real now. Especially, we have every state in the country has gotten massive amounts of federal COVID relief funding that has trickled down to almost every school district in the country. You're all competing for the same teachers, and you're creating new positions. You mentioned earlier you were trying to have smaller class sizes. Well, that requires more teachers. So there's more positions. So that's also the reason that there's so many vacancies. It's not necessarily everywhere that there's less teachers, but there are more positions to be filled. If you look at the numbers, actually, compared to, I think, 6 or 7 years ago, there's about 2% more teachers in Michigan and 9% fewer students. So you look at that, though, you have to dig in a little deeper. You look at that and say, so where's the problem? Well, the problem is that we're counting bodies. We're not necessarily counting people that are fully certified to teach the courses that they're teaching. We have a lot of teachers right now that are on interim certificates, substitute teachers now. There's a new state law in Michigan where any school staff member, from a bus driver to the superintendent, could teach a classroom as a substitute teacher now. So we're counting bodies. We're not counting fully certified teachers.
Right. So really quick, if you're just joining us, I'm your host, Will Glover. I'm here with Trace Morello from Chalk Beat, Detroit and Bridge, Michigan, Craig Thiel of the Citizens Research Council of Michigan, and Ypsilanti Schools Superintendent, Dr. Elena and Zachary Ross, and we're talking about Michigan's teacher workforce. So Tracy, based on what you were just saying, one of the things that I read in an article that you wrote was a quote from a teacher named Danielle, who said that her colleagues were not teaching because they wanted to, quote, pursue careers in fields that were better compensated for positions that have a better work-life balance. So were there any other factors that you learned about in your reporting that are, pushing teachers maybe away from the profession in general?
Many. Too many to name, but money is certainly one of them. But when that comes up in a conversation, it is less often about the actual dollars in the pocket as it is that salary is a sign of how much someone is valued, and teachers want to feel valued. And really, that's happening less and less. They don't feel trusted. There's a lot of vitriol there, a lot of second guessing by parents who want to, in some cases, micromanage what's happening in their kids' classrooms. And there's certainly a place for that. I mean, they're their children. But I think some of it has become frustrating for teachers who feel like they're being criticized at every turn. But money is certainly one sign that you're valued. So I think that is important, both intrinsically and tangibly.
Yeah. Well, as they say, cash is king. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, let me just piggyback on something Tracy said, and I'll just put Michigan's kind of teacher salary structure in kind of a national kind of picture, because I think it's worth mentioning here. And I agree 100%. Tracy said that compensation matters. There's other factors, to the degree to which teachers feel supported by administration, to the degree to which they have autonomy to run their classrooms. And now we have an entire culture war that's waging on top of this, that teachers, were never prepared to deal with, didn't expect to be prepared with, but they're having to deal with. So all of those factors play into kind of keeping teachers coming in to education, keeping, college graduates coming in, but also retaining those that we have. But as far as salaries go, Michigan, across the nation, has always had low starting salaries for its starting teachers when we look at average starting salary across the state. But once teachers gain experience in Michigan, they're compensated fairly well, up to close to the national average. So really, the compensation, just like kind of any intervention to address challenges in the workforce, need to be targeted. What that means is, giving pay raises to all the teachers in the state of Michigan would probably not be the most efficient way of dealing with the worker shortage. However, addressing early career teachers and the salaries that they're getting, the salaries for hard-to-staff classrooms, hard-to-staff districts, those are all going to be much more effective than addressing the teacher compensation issue writ large.
Right. So what you're saying is basically we just need to pay the people we need most adequately, as opposed to just trying to give everyone a blanket raise and hope that attracts more students. So really quick, because we're running out of time, Dr. Ross, another thing that we're talking about, because Tracy mentioned, there's the whole culture war, or Craig, you mentioned that. But there's also another layer to this that we should address, and that is the potential for violence happening in schools, particularly gun violence, because that's been happening more and more. It's happened close to home all over the country. Is that something that factors in, or Dr. Ross, is that something that you've concern that you've heard from current teachers, potential teachers, parents? How does that play into all of this?
Yeah, teachers have been concerned overall just about safety. And I think that's the huge focus. And so for our teachers in particular, we're talking about, yes, physical safety, but mental safety, because when we look at the underlying factor of what the causal piece is, it is mental health. And we understand that this is a huge focus in our schools. Students have been isolated. Students have the mental health issues have just really blown up since the pandemic. And so it's that mental health concern for not only our students, but also our staff, their wherewithal to be able to meet the students' needs, to meet their own needs. And so this pandemic has just exacerbated it. And so we see these unfortunate situations, tragic situations with gun violence. We see the suicidal rates for our children and attempted suicidal rates increase, and even our staff. And so we've got to take this mental health piece for the whole learner as well as the whole adult real seriously and personally in every single building across our state. This is a matter of emergency, not just gun safety, but the mental safety, the psychological safety of our staff and of our students.
Right. So let's move a little bit into a brighter space and talk about some of the solutions to some of the issues that we've just been addressing. The governor recently signed a bill. Is what's coming down the pipeline going to help? Is money simply enough, as we've been talking about, or are there other things that still need to be done? Tracy, we'll start with you. What are your thoughts about the legislation and the things to come?
Sure. There's a lot of good things for education in this budget. Michigan has more funding for schools than ever before. Like a lot of other states, it got a huge influx of COVID relief funding. But on top of that, the state's economy was more resilient than anyone expected coming out of the pandemic. And that has allowed for growth in the school aid budget. So funding is there like it never was before, but that also means that people's expectations are going to be high, and rightfully so. For a long time, I hear Dr. Rice all the time saying that Michigan schools have been, the state superintendent, Michael Rice, saying that schools have been underfunded for years. Well, now you've got a lot of money, a lot more money than you ever had before. So what are you going to do with it? So I think that there's a lot of pressure on him, on superintendents, on teachers, and I think students are going to feel that pressure too. But we still have to realize that the world is coming out of a really traumatic and unsettling time that has affected children in a multitude of ways. So while we need to hold schools accountable, we also need to recognize that money alone is not going to compensate for all the challenges that we've all faced in the last couple of years. Craig is really the school funding guru on today's panel, though. So I hope that
he was. I'm going to you next, Craig. What are your thoughts about what's coming down the pipeline?
Right. Well, you mentioned the governor's signature on the budget. The budget is a compromise between the legislative and the executive branch, and this legislature listened to the concerns of schools, as teachers, and has invested and plans to invest over $500 million in teacher recruitment. I point out recruitment because the pipeline to produce a teacher starts much earlier than enrollment in college. It starts in high school, in fact. And so the budget includes money for districts to begin growing your own programs. Tracy alluded to this. These are programs where you might have a staff person who's a parapro and wants to be a teacher, is a working mom, doesn't have time to do a full-time program, let alone the expenses. The state stepped up and is going to provide a stipend for that person to continue their employment with the district, but also pursue that teaching certificate with the plans of them then transitioning into an opening within their district. There's money for aspiring teachers entering 4-year college prep programs for the next 4 years. The state's planning on contributing $10,000 per academic year for these students. This is a big bonus that's going to fund about 2,500 students in our teacher prep programs. Just as a background, we only produce about 2,500 students every year coming out of teacher prep. So, this, is like 100% increase over that annual production number. There's also money to incent former military folks who have the leadership skills and background to enter the teaching ranks. So there's funding in there to support their certification. So the state's really anteing up here, and I would agree with Tracy. The proof isn't going to be for some time until we see the results of this, because it does take time when you're dealing with an issue of a pipeline where you got someone entering and they're not going to be certificated for 2 or 3 years later. But we're doing the right things. This budget does the right things towards that goal.
Right. So, Dr. Ross, we have a couple minutes before we get to a couple questions from our viewers, but I want to give you a chance to talk about that, because Tracy said that there is going to be some pressure on everybody going down the line when it comes to the influx of investment that's going on. Is that something that you feel? Are you feeling pressure for that? Is it excitement? Is it, are you ready to, really do what it needs, what you need to change the way things are right now? How are you feeling?
Yeah, well, number one, I just have to say I'm grateful that the governor added that additional $450 per pupil, because again, the funds we've been getting are federal dollars that have to be used for specific things, that had a plan, that have to be assessed and monitored. So I'm happy to share with folks and give the results. We had to think about that even as we developed our plans and after we heard from our community how we're going to spend those monies. So I'm not really concerned on that piece. What my piece is that structurally, we still have a problem. 2 years from now, we understand that we're still $1,021 short of what we need to continue to maintain. Those dollars cannot be put in teacher salaries that we got from ESSERs. And so when we are building folks, as Craig said, we need to be able to have wonderful starting salaries. We've got to be able to give them national board certification opportunities like at other states. And so we have to build the culture that supports these people that will be coming through the pipeline, who, when they enter, do we have the other funding for mental health services and support? Because teachers can't be everything to all of our students. And so we need that structure of support. So once they come in, they don't leave in 5 years, that they stay, that they have that consistency, that they see that they're supported, and they see that they're ready to be able to give students what they need when they're in that classroom.
Right. So we have more money to be able to make things better, but there's still going to be some issues. There's still going to be some things that we need to work out. But hopefully we'll be able to address that the next time we do this. But for now, let's look at some of the questions that we have from some of our viewers. From Susan on Facebook: how about teachers being certified for elementary education only so that they don't have to pass 12th grade algebra to teach first grade? I'm not sure exactly what that question is asking, so I'll go to a different Facebook question. Can social emotional learning initiatives be considered in the school districts to help the whole person, teacher, and student? So I'm thinking they're asking, can there be emotional learning initiatives in place to help with what we were talking about when it comes to the safety concerns, the psychological health of the students and teachers? And Dr. Ross, I'll give that one to you.
Yeah, we're again appreciative. Part of that funding was the Trails units. Those are in classroom units that are used to give students practical tools of how to de-escalate, how to really deal with themselves and their their behaviors, and it gives teachers tools to use. So the funding is necessary and the work is being done. We just want to continue it because we're just now seeing the impact of what students being out of school, that impact. And so we've got to continue that because that's a real piece to what teachers have to deal with in their classrooms. They're not just there doing the lessons, but they're also really supporting students in their growth and their mental health concerns.
Right. And before we get to the next Q&A question, there was another question that I wanted to ask, and that was about the attractiveness of the teaching profession. And one of the things that I kept thinking of was the fact that all these other industries have certain tools that levers that they can pull to make it more attractive. So, you have Facebook that has a cafeteria and restaurants in their buildings. You have Google that has a whole campus. It'll take you from your Google apartment to your office and feed you and get you back home. Is the way K-12 education, is the way our educational system set up, for lack of better words, out of date to be an attractive field for young students to want to go into? And is there a way that we can kind of address that? Is there a lever that, school districts can pull to say, hey, you're getting a lot of perks and you're being pulled in that direction, but this is really why you should come into the profession of being a teacher? And Tracy, I'll give you the first shot at that.
Sure. I think right now teachers are feeling like they're lacking some of the basic supports. So I don't think that, free lunch in the cafeteria is going to excite them when they can't get the textbooks that they need. Hopefully that's changing with the funding that we now have. But I think that they're looking for other things. They're looking for support. They're looking for time to collaborate with each other. Those are the things that I'm hearing. And also when you talk about perks, the kinds of things like Facebook and Google is doing, which sound really awesome and make me want to go work there too. But we're talking about public dollars. So you've got to be able to justify these expenditures and say, hey, we're having free bagel Fridays. I mean, it's probably not that much money, but it's tax dollars. So you have to be able to justify the expenses to taxpayers. So I think that that's a challenge that the corporate world doesn't have.
Yeah. Dr. Ross, what are your thoughts on that?
Two things. One, I want to address what Tracy said, because teachers, we can put all those things in place, but when they're subbing during their prep time, when they're not able to collaborate, that impacts the culture, no matter what we do. And so culture, right, eats strategy. And so some of the strategies we've been putting in place, we did get an outside grant. So every building has an oasis room for both the students and the staff where they can go in and have that relaxing time. This is a time that maybe the community can help, because we've talked about perhaps our local places, they get a discount at a local store, because of course we can't use tax dollars to do some of those internal things. We also offered compassion resilience circles for them, so then they can have that peer group to not talk about school but really talk about their needs. And so there are structures that we certainly should and need to put in place, and we also have got to deal with them having to sub, them not being able to collaborate and be that professional team that they want to and should be.
Right. So one last thing, Craig, what are you guys going to be paying attention to as all of this money pours into the education system? What are you going to have your eye on?
Well, it's a great question, and there's a lot of money. Just to lay the numbers out, Congress, over the 3 emergency packages for K through 12, allocated $190 billion across the country. Michigan's take of that is about $6 billion. So to put that in context, we allocate about $18 billion per year for our K through 12 system. So that $6 billion is about a third of a year's allocation. Very substantial amount of money. Districts are going to and have been spending it and will continue to spend it for the next couple years. What was unique about this federal money was 90% of it is going directly to school districts. And Congress told school districts, go find out what your districts, what your customers, what your students and families need, and respond to those needs. So as a researcher, I want to see to what extent are districts doing that work, because if it's just the school board and the school administration deciding how to spend the money, that's not meeting the congressional intent. And there are some set-asides, as Dr. Ross mentioned, with the federal money. There's a minimum threshold of 20% has to go to address learning loss. I would expect that those districts where kids are really far behind and did not see the growth that we normally would expect, that most of their focus would be on catching those kids up and not on facility improvements and not on broad-based teacher salary improvements. So that's the work I think is important going forward from a research perspective. And then ultimately taking the pulse on how efficacious the use of those dollars were in terms of getting those kids. So one, seeing if the monies are being budgeted for those purposes, and then seeing to what extent, those districts that were identified as losing the most in terms of the progress have made it up. And again, time will tell. This is not something that we're going to know definitively at the end of next year or the year after. We'll have a sense, and there's some very smart researchers, kind of taking the pulse in the interim, but long term, we'll know that in a few years.
Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have today. I'm sure we could talk about this until, as long as the day is. But I would like to thank our panelists. You guys have given us wonderful insight, and I can't wait to talk to you again in the future. Thank you for watching and for joining us. For more on the future of work, you can visit us at onedetroitpbs.org, and make sure to come back for our next Future of Work Town Hall on September 14th, where we'll be talking about women in the workforce. I'm Will Glover, and I'll see you in the future.
You can find more at onedetroitpbs.org or subscribe to our social media channels and sign up for our One Detroit newsletter.
Support for this program is provided by